The sound of splintering would echo across Samuel Miller's property as the massive black bear crashed through the old barn door at dawn. By sundown, the entire village of Pinewood would be forever changed, not because of the destruction caused by the cornered animal, but because of what the aging farmer chose to do when faced with a 700-pound predator trapped among his life's possessions. His decision defied generations of local wisdom, shocked his neighbors, and ultimately revealed a truth about coexistence that no one in the small farming community had been willing to consider. Samuel Miller was not the type of man who attracted attention. At 67, his weathered face and calloused hands told the common story of decades working the same land his grandfather had cleared. His faded blue overalls and quiet demeanor made him nearly invisible at town gatherings. He paid his taxes, attended church on Sundays, and fixed his own fences. Nothing about Samuel suggested he would become the most talked-about resident in county history before the week was through. Pinewood was a village where traditions ran as deep as the surrounding forest. When it came to wildlife, especially predators, the community held firm beliefs passed down through generations. Bear sightings meant school closures. Wolf tracks led to hunting parties. Mountain lion rumors sparked armed patrols of farm perimeters. The village maintained its uneasy relationship with the wilderness through well-established responses that no one questioned. The taxidermied bear head mounted above the post office entrance served as a constant reminder of the clear boundary between civilization and wilderness. Sheriff Parker kept special ammunition for wildlife emergencies. The local hardware store sold more bear traps than garden tools each spring. Even the elementary school curriculum included mandatory lessons on what to do when encountering forest predators, with the first rule always being, report immediately so adults can eliminate the threat. Children grew up understanding that dangerous animals would be feared and, when necessary, destroyed for human safety. So when the news spread that Samuel Miller had found a fully grown black bear trapped inside his barn, destroying equipment and supplies worth thousands of dollars, the village prepared for a familiar story. They expected gunshots, triumphant hunters, and perhaps a new trophy for the volunteer fire department's wall. What they could never have anticipated was how one quiet farmer's unexpected response would challenge everything they thought they knew about their place in the natural world. Samuel Miller followed his morning routine with the precision of a man who had done the same tasks for decades. Rise at 5, coffee brewing by 5:15, boots on by 5:30, and out to check the animals before the sun fully crested the distant hills. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he made his way across the frosted grass toward the large red barn that had stood on the property since his grandfather's time. The first sign that something was wrong came when Samuel noticed the barn door hanging awkwardly from one hinge. His pace quickened, mind racing through possibilities. A storm had passed through 2 nights ago, but it hadn't been strong enough to damage solid oak. As he drew closer, the sound of crashing from within the barn made his heart pound against his ribs. Samuel approached cautiously, years of rural living having taught him the dangers of rushing into unknown situations. Peering through the gap where the door had been forced open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, a massive black bear was frantically pacing between farm equipment, knocking over shelves and sending tools scattering across the concrete floor. The animal had already destroyed the feed storage containers, torn apart several bales of hay, and knocked over the antique tractor Samuel had been restoring. The bear, clearly panicked by its entrapment, had attempted to escape through several of the barn windows, but they were too small for its enormous frame. Glass shards littered the floor, and blood smeared one of the window frames where the animal had injured itself in its desperation. The valuable milking equipment Samuel used for his small herd lay in pieces, representing thousands of dollars in damages that his modest farm income could ill afford to replace. The immediate danger was unmistakable. If Samuel approached, the cornered bear would likely attack. If it somehow escaped without guidance, it might head toward his house, or, worse, toward the village where children would soon be walking to school. Bears in Pinewood were not considered gentle creatures to be admired from afar. They were threats to be eliminated. Every resident in the county knew what happened in these situations. Farmer Thompson had shot a bear near his chicken coop last spring and was celebrated at the town meeting that month. Old Man Jenkins had called animal control when a bear cub wandered onto his property, and the authorities had arrived with tranquilizer guns and grim expressions. Even the school principal had organized a hunting party when bear tracks were spotted near the playground. The unspoken rule in Pinewood was clear. When dangerous wildlife threatened property or safety, the response was swift and final. As Samuel watched the bear destroy his livelihood, everyone in the village would expect him to reach for his rifle or, at minimum, to call Sheriff Parker's wildlife emergency line. This was simply what farmers did. Samuel Miller backed away from the barn slowly, careful not to make sudden movements that might further agitate the trapped bear. Standing in his yard, he weighed his options while the sounds of destruction continued inside the structure that had been in his family for generations. The shotgun in his house was loaded. The phone in his pocket could bring armed help within minutes. The bear trap he kept in his tool shed could be set up at the barn's entrance, ready for when the animal finally found its way out. These were the solutions Samuel had been raised to employ. His father would have reached for the gun without hesitation. His neighbors would expect him to call the sheriff immediately. The community would understand if he chose to eliminate the threat to his property and safety. No one would question him. In fact, they would praise his quick thinking and decisive action. But as Samuel stood there listening to the frightened animal's movements, something unexpected stirred within him. He remembered a conversation with a traveling wildlife photographer who had passed through Pinewood last summer. The man had spoken passionately about how bears rarely attacked humans unless they felt threatened, how they were intelligent creatures capable of finding their way out of trouble if given the chance. Most importantly, he had explained how bears were just as frightened of humans as humans were of them. Samuel made a decision that would have seemed incomprehensible to everyone in Pinewood. He would not shoot the bear. He would not call for help. He would not trap the animal. Instead, he would give it a way out, on its own terms and in its own time. With deliberate calmness, Samuel walked to his tool shed and gathered rope, work gloves, and a small hand saw. He circled around the back of the barn, where a smaller door led to the hay storage area. Carefully, he tied the door fully open, securing it so it could not swing shut. Then he moved to the main entrance, using the saw to remove the partially broken door from its remaining hinge. He worked methodically, ensuring the opening was clear of any obstructions that might injure the bear as it exited. Next, Samuel walked the perimeter of his property, checking that all gates were open, creating a clear path leading away from his farm and back toward the forest beyond his eastern field. He moved his truck to block the road leading toward the village, eliminating the possibility that the bear might wander in that direction when it finally emerged. The final step in Samuel's unusual plan required the most courage. He entered his house and packed a small bag containing water, sandwiches, his thermos filled with hot coffee, and a folding chair. He took a pair of binoculars from the hall closet and his worn copy of North American Wildlife from the bookshelf. Then he positioned himself on the far side of his front yard, about 200 yards from the barn, close enough to monitor the situation, but far enough away to give the bear space. Samuel settled into his chair and prepared to wait. His plan was remarkably simple, yet completely foreign to the practices of Pinewood. He would not force the bear out. He would not threaten it. He would simply create safe conditions for its escape, and then give the animal time to find its own way to freedom. As he poured his first cup of coffee, Samuel knew that what he was doing would seem incomprehensible to his neighbors when they inevitably discovered the situation. News traveled faster than wildfire in Pinewood. By mid-morning, the first whispers of Samuel Miller's situation had reached the general store. By noon, every resident within 5 miles knew that Samuel had a full-grown black bear trapped in his barn. By early afternoon, cars began turning onto the dirt road leading to the Miller farm, bringing concerned neighbors, curious onlookers, and self-appointed wildlife experts. Martha Jenkins from the post office was the first to arrive, having heard about the bear from her nephew, who delivered milk to the farms. She pulled into Samuel's driveway, expecting to find emergency vehicles or at least a sheriff. Instead, she discovered Samuel calmly sitting in a folding chair, binoculars in hand, seemingly watching his own barn from a distance. "Samuel Miller, what on earth are you doing?" she called out as she hurried toward him, keeping a nervous eye on the barn where occasional crashes could still be heard. "I came as soon as I heard. Have you called Parker yet? He's getting the rifles ready." Samuel's quiet explanation of his plan to simply wait was met with Martha's open-mouthed shock. She immediately pulled out her phone, and within 30 minutes, a dozen more vehicles had appeared. Bill Thompson, whose family had hunted in these woods for 4 generations, approached Samuel with the confidence of someone whose opinion on wildlife matters was never questioned in the village. "This is madness, Samuel. That bear will destroy everything you own in there," he warned, pointing emphatically toward the barn. "I brought my rifle. We can end this right now before it gets worse." Samuel politely declined the offer. Principal Wilson arrived next, her face tight with worry. "Samuel, we had to keep the children inside for recess today because of this. What if that thing heads toward the school when it gets out? Have you thought about that?" Old Henry Clark, who had lost livestock to predators years ago, didn't bother with pleasantries. "Your father would be ashamed to see you sitting here doing nothing while a wild animal tears apart your property. This isn't respect for nature, it's foolishness." As the afternoon wore on, the crowd grew to nearly 30 people. They stood in small groups, shaking heads and casting worried glances toward the barn. Some openly questioned Samuel's mental state. Others offered to call animal control without his permission for his own good. A few suggested that at his age, perhaps he simply couldn't handle the situation properly. Sheriff Parker arrived, siren briefly wailing before he cut it off. He approached Samuel with a mix of official concern and personal bewilderment. "Sam, I got tranquilizers in the car and 3 deputies on standby. Everyone in town is worried sick. This isn't how we handle these situations around here, and you know it. That bear has already destroyed thousands of dollars of your property. What are you thinking?" Through it all, Samuel remained seated in his chair, calmly explaining his decision to each new arrival. With each explanation, the disbelief among the gathered villagers only seemed to grow. Predictions of disaster circulated through the crowd. The bear would attack someone. It would head for the village. It would destroy everything Samuel owned. No one, not a single person among them, predicted what would actually happen. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, the atmosphere around the Miller farm grew increasingly tense. The crowd of villagers had settled into an uncomfortable vigil, their cars forming a semicircle behind Samuel's position. Children who had been brought by curious parents were kept firmly behind the line of vehicles. Whispered conversations rippled through the gathering, punctuated by occasional loud crashes from a barn that silenced everyone momentarily before the worried murmurs resumed. The pressure on Samuel intensified with each passing hour. Mayor Johnson arrived, using his position of authority to try a different approach with the stubborn farmer. "Samuel, I respect your property rights, but this has become a community safety issue," he explained in the reasonable tone he used for town meetings. "We have nearly half the village standing out here worried sick. Parker has already fielded calls from folks 5 miles out asking if they should evacuate. Be sensible now." Reverend Thomas tried appealing to Samuel's sense of responsibility. "Sometimes the wisest course is to recognize when a situation is beyond our control. Samuel, there's no shame in accepting help from those trained to handle these matters." Even Dr. Collins, who had treated 3 generations of Millers, joined the chorus of concern. "At your age, the stress of the situation cannot be good for your heart. Please reconsider your position." Each time someone new approached him with advice, warnings, or outright demands, Samuel responded with the same calm explanation. He believed the bear was more afraid than dangerous. He trusted that given time and space, the animal would find its way back to the forest. He understood their concerns, but asked for their patience. Inside the barn, the sounds of destruction had become less frequent. Sometimes 10 or 15 minutes would pass in eerie silence before another crash would send a jolt through the watching crowd. The wildlife expert from the county center, who had arrived at the sheriff's request, indicated this likely meant the bear was tiring or had settled into one area of the barn. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the farm, the tension reached a breaking point. Several men, led by Bill Thompson, gathered near the sheriff's vehicle, gesturing animatedly as they discussed taking matters into their own hands. Parents started moving their children back to cars, preparing to leave before darkness fell. The sheriff checked his tranquilizer gun for the 3rd time. Through it all, Samuel remained in his chair, a solitary figure calm amid the anxiety surrounding him. He occasionally raised his binoculars to check the barn openings or made notes in the small pad he kept beside him. His face revealed nothing of his inner thoughts, but his posture never slumped. His resolve never wavered. The standoff between one quiet farmer and an entire village's expectations had created a tension so thick it seemed to vibrate in the cooling evening air. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone felt the weight of the moment. Something had to give, and soon. The golden light of sunset bathed the farm in amber hues as shadows lengthened across the yard. Nearly 4 hours had passed since the first villagers had arrived, and a strange hush had fallen over the crowd. The conversations had died down to whispers. The sheriff had stepped away to take a call. Even the most vocal critics of Samuel's approach had fallen silent, their arguments exhausted against his immovable patience. It happened so gradually that at first, no one noticed. A dark shape moved in the shadows of the barn's main entrance. The bear, massive and powerful, stood motionless in the doorway, its nose testing the air. Someone gasped, triggering a wave of reaction through the gathered villagers. Parents pulled children behind them. Several men reached instinctively for weapons. The sheriff spun around, tranquilizer gun half raised. Samuel alone remained perfectly still, making no sudden movements, not even rising from his chair. The bear surveyed the scene before it. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed to lock eyes with Samuel across the distance that separated them. No one breathed. No one spoke. The entire world seemed suspended in that fragile moment of connection between man and beast. Then, with surprising grace for such a large animal, the bear turned away from the crowd. It moved unhurriedly along the exact path Samuel had cleared earlier, lumbering across the eastern field toward the tree line. Not once did it look back or show any sign of aggression. It simply walked away, disappearing into the forest as naturally as if returning from an ordinary day's foraging. The silence that followed was profound. Mouths hung open in disbelief. The sheriff slowly lowered his weapon. Children peeked around their parents' legs to witness the miracle of the peaceful departure. Even Bill Thompson stood frozen, his rifle pointed harmlessly at the ground. What should have been a violent confrontation, what could have ended in bloodshed or property destruction, had instead concluded with a quiet dignity that left everyone speechless. The bear was gone. No shots had been fired. No one had been injured. The natural order had been restored through patience rather than force. Samuel finally stood, folded his chair, and turned to face the astonished villagers. The expressions he encountered reflected nothing short of pure amazement. For several minutes after the bear disappeared into the forest, no one moved. The villagers stood frozen in place, as if breaking the silence might somehow undo the peaceful resolution they had just witnessed. Sheriff Parker was the first to step forward, holstering his tranquilizer gun with hands that seemed slightly unsteady. He approached Samuel, who was calmly packing his thermos and book into his small bag. In 23 years of handling wildlife situations in this county, I have never seen anything like that, the sheriff admitted, his voice quiet with wonder. His words seemed to break the spell, and suddenly the farmyard filled with the murmur of conversations as people turned to one another to process what they had witnessed. Mayor Johnson shook his head repeatedly as he spoke with Reverend Thomas. Did you see how it just looked at him? Almost like there was some understanding between them. The Reverend nodded, his previous concerns about Samuel's judgment notably absent from his expression. Parents who had been sheltering their children now brought them forward, explaining in hushed, respectful tones about what they had just seen. The narrative had shifted dramatically from warnings about dangerous predators to observations about the bear's calm behavior and natural dignity. Martha Jenkins approached Samuel with a cup of water she had brought from her car. I was so certain this would end badly, she confessed. I had already planned what I would say at your funeral if that beast attacked you. Her attempt at humor couldn't mask her genuine amazement. Bill Thompson stood apart from the others, his rifle now safely stored in his truck. He seemed to be struggling with the evidence that contradicted his lifetime of assumptions about wildlife encounters. When Samuel walked past, Bill merely nodded, a gesture that contained more respect than any words he might have offered. As twilight deepened into evening, small groups formed around Samuel's yard. The conversations were animated but thoughtful, punctuated by frequent glances toward the forest edge where the bear had disappeared. Questions emerged that had never before been considered seriously in Pinewood. Were there other ways to handle wildlife encounters? Had the village been too quick to reach for weapons in the past? What else might Samuel know about peaceful coexistence that the rest of them had never considered? By the time people began returning to their vehicles to head home, something fundamental had shifted in the collective consciousness of Pinewood. The story they would tell was not about a dangerous predator or a narrow escape, but about patience rewarded and unexpected grace. In the space of a single evening, Samuel Miller had not only saved a bear's life, he had planted the seeds of transformation in a community that had never questioned its approach to the natural world. The story of Samuel Miller and the barn bear spread through Pinewood like pollen in spring, carried on the whispers of those who had witnessed it firsthand. By the following morning, the local newspaper editor had arrived at Samuel's farm, notebook in hand, eager to document what people were already calling the Miller Miracle. Samuel answered questions with characteristic humility, emphasizing that he had simply trusted what he observed rather than what he had been taught to fear. Within a week, changes began appearing throughout the community. The elementary school principal invited a wildlife educator to speak to the children, replacing the annual hunter's safety presentation for the first time in 20 years. Sheriff Parker organized a workshop on non-lethal wildlife deterrence, attended by farmers who would have scoffed at such ideas only days before. The hunting lodge still displayed its trophies, but conversations there had shifted noticeably toward conservation rather than conquest. When a mother bear and cubs were spotted near the Thompson property line the following month, no hunting party was formed. Instead, Bill Thompson himself constructed a temporary electric fence around his beehives and waited for family to move on naturally. He later reported with surprising pride that his property had remained undamaged during the bear's 3-day visit. The regional news picked up the story next, sending a camera crew to interview Samuel. His quiet explanation that sometimes the best solution requires no intervention at all resonated far beyond Pinewood's boundaries. Environmental groups reached out, wildlife management officials requested consultations, and neighboring communities began reconsidering their own protocols for wildlife encounters. Samuel never sought the attention, but he accepted his unexpected role with grace. The barn where it all happened became something of a local landmark. Visitors would often find Samuel there, willing to show the damage that remained unrepaired, not out of neglect, but as a deliberate reminder of the lesson learned. These broken beams tell a better story than perfect ones ever could, he would explain to curious visitors. The most profound change, however, was invisible to outsiders, but deeply felt by every Pinewood resident. A community that had defined itself partly through its dominance over nature now found itself exploring a more nuanced relationship with the wilderness that surrounded it. Children grew up learning about coexistence rather than conflict, about observation before action, about patience as a form of wisdom. Years later, when Samuel Miller passed away peacefully in his sleep, the entire village gathered to honor him. Near his grave, they placed a simple stone bench facing the forest edge, inscribed with the words that had transformed their community. Sometimes the best thing we can do for another living creature is to give it space and time to find its own way. The bear never returned to Samuel's barn, but in many ways, it never truly left Pinewood, either.